The world is tilting towards China. For the first time in generations, the unipolar era is crumbling. A true multipolar world is rising from its ashes. Countries across the global south, nations long forced to kneel to Washington, to twist their economies to American whims, to surrender sovereignty over their own resources, are quietly, decisively, and in some cases dramatically turning eastward. Was this shift inevitable? Was it triggered by America's reckless stewardship of its own hegemony? Or is a deeper, almost gravitational force at work? One that no amount of sanctions, lectures, or carrier strike groups can defy. Today, I'm joined by my good friend and one of the sharpest geopolitical minds out there, Arnaud Bertrand, to unpack exactly what's happening and why it's accelerating faster than most in the West want to admit. We'll begin with his landmark essay, China's Gravitational Centrality, published in Horizons magazine, Autumn 2025 edition, a piece that reads less like an analysis and more like a roadmap of the future we're already living in. Stick around. Once the reading is done, Arnaud joins me live to go deeper, answer the big questions, and reveal what this new world order actually means for all of us.
That's the irony. In many ways, the anti-China propaganda has actually helped China and was a big strategic mistake for the West.
Without further ado, let's dive in. China's gravitational centrality, the logic of success in a multipolar world. Arnaud Bertrand, nothing escapes gravity. We hold this truth to be self-evident in the domain of physics, as we experience it every day. Yet when we turn to geopolitics, we often behave as if will and rhetoric could somehow defy such forces. We celebrate leaders for their eloquence and charisma, mistaking the spectacle of power for power itself. But leadership cannot rewrite geography, nor can stirring speeches alter demographic realities or resource endowments. A gifted orator leading a strategically vulnerable state remains constrained by facts as immutable as the laws of physics. In an age dominated by narrative warfare and ideological positioning, we risk forgetting that beneath the noise of political communication lie structural forces, geopolitical gravity, if you will, that determine what is actually possible. Consider the historical record. Why has the West dominated the world since the Industrial Revolution? Was this due to stirring speeches or technological and manufacturing supremacy? Why did the Allies prevail in World War II? Because Roosevelt and Churchill were more eloquent than Hitler? Because the Allies' values were morally superior to fascism? Or was it because the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in industrial output and access to strategic resources? American political scientist Samuel Huntington put it bluntly: the West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. End quote. A harsh and oversimplified formulation, perhaps, but one that captures an uncomfortable truth about the primacy of raw power. Europe seems especially vulnerable to forgetting such lessons. Hubert Védrine, France's former foreign minister, repeatedly calls out this tendency, accusing Europeans of thinking they inhabit a world of Care Bears, bisounours in French, whereas the world remains very much Jurassic Park. In all fairness, this European mindset was entirely rational, even advantageous for decades. During the unipolar moment when American hegemony went unchallenged, Atlanticism was the obvious course. Bind yourself to the hegemon and reap the benefits of proximity to power. Preparing for American decline and renewed great power competition while living under American protection would have risked being counterproductive, a form of disloyalty that Washington would have hardly rewarded. More fundamentally, American hegemony allowed Europeans to internalize Fukuyama's end-of-history thesis, the idea that liberal democracy's triumph had rendered traditional geopolitical competition obsolete. Why invest in defense when great power struggles are over? Why think in terms of hard power when the future belongs to norms, institutions, and moral lectures? Atlanticism didn't just provide physical security. It enabled an entire world of Care Bears logic. There is an even deeper cognitive barrier. The West has been globally dominant since the Industrial Revolution. After 2 centuries, such dominance feels like natural law rather than historical contingency. Picture a European politician circa 2005, the moment when serious preparation should have arguably begun, campaigning on this platform. We must ready ourselves for a world where America recedes and China surpasses the entire West technologically and industrially. That obviously would have been electoral suicide, yet that unelectable diagnosis proved precisely correct, and acting on it would have been the right thing to do. Perhaps most importantly, no one alive, nor their parents, nor even their grandparents, remembers a multipolar world, particularly one with powerful non-Western poles. We lack not just policy experience, but cultural memory of such an order. Little surprise, then, that the signals of such a world's emergence went unheeded, yet the signals were unmistakable, if one bothered to look. From 2015 to 2023, I lived in China, and the chasm between Western narratives and observable reality was staggering. Our media portrayed China as a dystopian regime, a totalitarian anachronism that had missed the memo about history's end and would inevitably collapse or liberalize. All European politicians could seemingly do about China, and this still largely holds true today, was performative, condescending moralism that satisfied domestic audiences while antagonizing Beijing and doing precisely nothing to address the material power shift underway. Indeed, this actively perpetuated the world of Care Bears mythology that prevented us from seeing such a shift clearly in the first place. Meanwhile, the reality I was experiencing on the ground couldn't have been more different. The China I saw was going through a genuine renaissance, a country advancing at breathtaking speed, progressively leapfrogging the West in critical domains. The asymmetry of knowledge struck me the most. I was constantly meeting Chinese professionals who had studied at Oxford, Stanford, or Sciences Po, spoke fluent English or French, and understood the West intimately. But during these extended travels across China, even in major metropolises, I would go weeks without seeing another Westerner. They had invested in understanding us, we hadn't deemed them worth understanding. The condescension was breathtaking. This is a country of 1.4 billion people with a middle class of hundreds of millions enjoying living standards comparable to, or sometimes exceeding, those in Europe. Yet our discourse remained stuck in 19th century Orientalism, as if we were still cataloging exotic tribes in need of Western tutelage. I entered China believing its citizens were indoctrinated by state propaganda. I left certain that we were far more propagandized, with our world of Care Bears thinking insulating us from reality. We committed a cardinal error. We started believing our own moral sermons constituted strategic analysis. What does this all have to do with gravity? Because that is a key characteristic of a multipolar world. This is a world where countries must navigate an order with several massive bodies, each exercising its own gravitational pull. A more complex choreography than the simple bipolar dynamics of the Cold War or the singular pull of unipolarity. Old texts by Jesuit missionaries to China, such as Matteo Ricci, have always been extremely instructive. They provided a fascinating window into how we once engaged between civilizations, before the power differential became so great that mutual understanding became optional. The Jesuits arrived in a China that was wealthier, more populous, and technologically comparable to Europe. That world, for all intents and purposes, was multipolar and absent overwhelming power asymmetry. We had to engage with other poles on terms of rough equality, leading to genuine intellectual exchange. The missionaries learned Chinese, studied Confucian classics, and adapted Catholic theology to local contexts, not from a place of enlightened multiculturalism, but because it was a necessity. They understood what we have forgotten, that when you cannot impose your framework, you must learn to operate within another's. This is the logic returning to international affairs, a world where the West lacks the overwhelming power to impose its preferences, forcing a return to the older diplomatic arts of accommodation, translation, and interest-based rather than values-based negotiation. Contemporary Asia already largely operates this way. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is perhaps the perfect exemplar. This organization consists of 11 countries, with the addition of Timor-Leste in October 2025, with radically different political systems. These include Communist Vietnam, the Islamic monarchy of Brunei, military-influenced Thailand, the Christian and liberal Philippines, and single-party-led Singapore. They don't agree on how societies should be organized, yet they cooperate extensively on trade, infrastructure, and security. Why? Because geography creates shared interests that override ideological differences. They all depend on the Malacca Straits for maritime trade. They all benefit from regional stability that enables commerce. They all want to avoid becoming pawns in great power competition. The ASEAN model isn't some high-minded idealism. It's geography-driven pragmatism. Or take another large Asia-led institution as an example, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is the world's largest regional organization, accounting for 46% of the world's population and roughly 40% of global GDP at purchasing power parity, nearly 3 times the economic weight of the EU. In their case, the ideological divide is even starker than in ASEAN, since the organization encompasses Asia's archenemies, India and Pakistan, as well as China, which can hardly be called India's best friend. Yet they all formed this organization anyway, not because they resolved their ideological differences or are even seeking to do so, but simply because they share borders, energy corridors, and security concerns, and don't have the luxury of ignoring each other. Geography doesn't care about values or historical grievances. The common denominator they landed on is interesting. The UN Charter, interpreted strictly. If you read their latest 2025 Tianjin Joint Statement, they obsessively reference it and its principles such as sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference in internal affairs. This works as a common denominator precisely because it demands no ideological alignment. The Charter doesn't require political systems to converge. It simply establishes a minimal framework for coexistence. Respect sovereignty, don't interfere in internal affairs, apply rules equally. When no country has the power to impose its preferences and all countries must coexist in proximity, this minimal framework becomes the maximum achievable, and perhaps even the maximum framework necessary. There is a fascinating paradox at play here. The West spent decades promoting a rules-based liberal order as the evolution beyond crude geography and sovereignty. Yet it is their own selective enforcement of these rules that is driving the world back to precisely that older framework. Every unilateral sanction imposed without UN authorization, every military intervention justified by elastic interpretations of international law, every instance of rules for thee but not for me, undermines the entire premise of the order. The irony is that this outcome was both foreseeable and foreseen. In May 2003, just 2 months after the invasion of Iraq, former U.S. President Bill Clinton gave a commencement speech at Yale University where he spelled out the choice with devastating clarity. If you believe that maintaining power and control and absolute freedom of movement and sovereignty is important to your country's future, there's nothing inconsistent in the U.S. continuing to behave unilaterally. But if you believe that we should be trying to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in when we're no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then you wouldn't do that, end quote. The implication was unmistakable. You cannot spend your hegemonic moment ignoring your own rules and expect those rules to protect you when your power wanes. Yet the U.S. chose that exact path, maintaining absolute freedom of action while promoting a rules-based order for everyone else. The irony is almost poetic. In refusing to bind itself to its own rules when it had the power to ignore them, it destroyed the credibility of those rules, as well as the U.S.-led global order in the process. In the meantime, China spent the past few decades betting that the underlying importance of geopolitical gravity would apply regardless of any ideological superstructure. While the United States invested in military bases and its soft power apparatus, China focused on becoming massive, economically, technologically, infrastructurally. Mass creates its own gravitational field. A country of 1.4 billion people with the world's largest manufacturing capacity and growing technological sophistication exerts pull simply by existing. You don't need to share China's political system to benefit from its markets, to connect to its infrastructure networks, or to participate in its supply chains. This is why China's influence has grown even as its political model remains alien to many of its partners. Gravity doesn't require affection, only proximity and mass. The best illustration of this is the attitude of Argentina's President Javier Milei, who before getting elected swore that not only he will not do business with China, he won't do business with any communists. In his own words, he is a man who couldn't be more ideologically opposed to China. Yet after taking office, here is what he had to say in a November 2024 interview for The Economist. Relations with China are excellent. They are a fabulous partner. They don't ask for anything in return. All they ask is that I don't disturb them. It's fabulous. It's fabulous. They are fabulous. I mean, I swear to you, they do not ask anything. Nothing. They want to trade calmly. And you know what? We have economies that are complementary. Therefore, the well-being of Argentines requires that I deepen my commercial ties with China. Why? Because they are complementary economies." End quote. What better illustration is there of how geopolitical gravity overrides ideology? Milei didn't change his ideology, nor did China ask him to. Yet the relationship makes sense because it's mutually beneficial. The pre-ideological logic is returning. You don't need to share values to trade, only mutual benefit. Oriana Schuyler Mastro, formerly the Pentagon's top strategic planner on China and now a professor at Stanford University, recently posed this rhetorical question. The war in Afghanistan cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives, so which one is more impactful on the world? End quote. The question answers itself when we examine what has remained. Military bases can be withdrawn, occupations can end, interventions can be abandoned, as Afghanistan itself proved. But infrastructure creates permanent relationships. A Chinese-built port in Pakistan doesn't care who is president in Washington or Beijing. High-speed rail connecting Thailand to Laos continues operating regardless of ideological winds. These physical connections make neighbors economically entangled in ways that outlast any particular political alignment. This, incidentally, has always been China's modus operandi. We often misunderstand its so-called tributary system as being similar to European colonialism, but it couldn't have been more different. In fact, George Yeo, Singaporean cabinet minister for 21 years, of which he spent 7 as Minister for Foreign Affairs, recently reminded us in a speech, tributary is the wrong translation. Chao gong is to pay respect, in response to which you will enjoy China's largesse. It is not the tributary in which Dubrovnik pays the Ottoman Sultan in order to keep menace at bay. That was protection money. When you use tributary in the Western context, you think of it as protection money when, in China's case, it's the opposite. You give China some trinkets, you get back gold. This is how it was, and that's why Southeast Asian countries competed with one another to be tributaries. Japanese merchants were fighting for tokens to trade in China. China used their market, their economics to control behavior. End quote. China today is simply applying the same logic at global scale, using economic mass and market access to create gravitational pull, making partnership more attractive than resistance. Is China different? This relates to one of the most hotly debated questions in geopolitics. If China had the capabilities, would it want to rule Asia the way the United States ruled its own hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine? If you follow realist theorists of international relations like John Mearsheimer, you'd think the answer is obviously yes. After all, that's what great powers supposedly always want: exclusive control over their neighborhood and recognition as a regional hegemon. Why would China be any different? Zhao Long, deputy director of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, recently explained why China would in fact be different. Whereas Western realist thinking operates on win-lose logic, where great powers must dominate exclusive territories, China's approach is fundamentally systemic, gravitational rather than territorial. It is focused not on carving out exclusive spheres, but on becoming a massive body that everything else must orbit around. The metaphor Zhao uses is revealing: the human body, with China as the heart. Would it make sense for the heart to win against the lungs, liver, or brain? Should the heart carve up the chest cavity as its exclusive sphere of influence? Obviously not. The heart's health depends entirely on circulation flowing freely throughout the entire system, nourishing every organ and enabling the whole body to thrive. Isolate the heart from the rest of the body, and both die. As Zhao writes, China's strategic and economic rise is predicated not on regional containment but on global integration. And Beijing's influence grows when its regional partners are economically linked to a wider global system in which China plays a central role, not when those partners are locked into rigid blocks. End quote. This is precisely what gravitational centrality looks like in practice: influence derived not from excluding others, but from making yourself so economically massive and so central to critical networks that everyone must engage with you whether they want to or not. In that logic, an arrangement like the Monroe Doctrine actually undermines your objectives. Additionally, a Yalta-style sphere of influence arrangement would betray the very principles China has championed for decades. In a 1974 UN speech, Deng Xiaoping himself warned that if China ever changed her color and turned into a superpower that played the tyrant, then the people of the world should identify her as social imperialism, expose it, oppose it, and work together with the Chinese people to overthrow it. End quote. Strong words. and accepting a sphere of influence would be precisely the transformation Deng warned against. It would validate Mearsheimer's arguments that China is no different from any other great power, just another player in the same old game of domination. This would legitimize anti-China alignments and destroy the moral authority China has carefully built with the global South, which is drawn to China precisely because it offers an alternative to traditional great power politics. There's a historical parable that illustrates the trap perfectly. At some point during the Warring States period in Chinese history, China had two dominant states, Qin and Qi. Qin was brutal, Qi was more benevolent, and smaller states preferred Qi. The king of Qin proposed, "Let's stop calling ourselves kings and proclaim ourselves emperors. I'll be the Western emperor, you'll be the Eastern emperor." The king of Qi agreed. But immediately, the smaller states that had favored Qi turned against him. Why? Because by becoming co-emperor, Qi became complicit in Qin's methods. The smaller states knew Qi could no longer protect them, so they obeyed Qin out of fear. Qi had isolated itself through association. Eventually, Qin defeated everyone, including Qi, and unified China. The parallel today is that if China starts carving up the world into spheres of influence alongside America and Russia, it becomes a co-emperor in the very hegemonic system it criticizes. Countries that currently see China as offering a fundamentally different model would suddenly view it as just another imperial power playing the same old game. And if that's the case, if China is going to be as hypocritical as the West about sovereignty and non-interference, why not stick with the devil you know? This sphere of influence approach is also, incidentally, precisely what has driven the West's relative decline while enabling China's rise. The West's block logic, carving the world into exclusive zones of control, has generated endless friction, drained resources, and ultimately accelerated the very multipolarity it sought to prevent. China's gravitational model, by contrast, enabled its unprecedented rise. That's the irony in watching some analysts predict that China will adopt spheres of influence. They're essentially saying that China will abandon the approach that's working in favor of the one that's demonstrably failing. No, China is much more likely to keep that model, influence through gravitational pull rather than military dominance, attraction rather than imposition, not only because it has worked so far, but also because it's likely to continue doing so in a multipolar world. It's logical. In a unipolar world, you have a monopoly on power. Impose your terms and everyone else can take it or leave it. In a bipolar world, as George Kennan, the architect of U.S. Cold War strategy, wrote, the game is ideological competition. It involves demonstrating your spiritual vitality is capable of holding its own among the major ideological currents to win hearts and minds, like rival brands competing for loyalty. But multipolar competition is fundamentally different. When multiple major powers compete for influence, countries don't have to choose teams anymore. They can partner with whoever offers the best terms on any given issue. This transforms international relations from demanding allegiance to earning partnerships. Multipolarity kills ideology through simple market logic. When customers have choices, sellers must compete on substance rather than brand loyalty. Where does that leave Europe, our old continent stuck in its world of Care Bears? To call it ill-prepared for the present moment would be generous. There are two sides to this new multipolar coin. The first is whether Europe can generate gravitational pull itself, and the second is whether it can avoid being captured entirely by America's gravitational field. These questions are related but distinct. Europe could theoretically generate significant gravity. It has economic mass, technological capacity, and a large integrated market. But gravity requires more than size. It requires the willingness and capability to use that mass strategically. This means making decisions that might antagonize Washington, fostering independent energy relationships despite American opposition, engaging with China on European rather than American terms, developing independent military capabilities that don't automatically align with NATO. Europe has consistently refused these choices, preferring the comfort of Atlanticism. The result is structural dependence. Europe relies on American security guarantees, American technology platforms, American financial infrastructure. In gravitational terms, Europe has potential mass but remains locked in America's orbit. In that regard, the recent Nexperia debacle is grimly instructive. After U.S. officials told the Dutch in June 2025 that this Holland-based semiconductor manufacturer must rid itself of Chinese ownership to avoid American sanctions, the Dutch government used a 1952 emergency law, designed for requisitioning critical supplies during wartime, to seize the company. China promptly retaliated by banning Nexperia's Chinese operations from exporting anything, crippling a company that does 80% of its production in China. The result? Europe's Automotive Association warned of industry-wide production stoppages within weeks, as Nexperia supplies critical chips to virtually every European carmaker. In effect, Europe is witnessing the destruction of one of its flagship tech companies and endangering its most important industry, all to comply with extraterritorial American legislation targeting Chinese ownership. The best framework for understanding Nexperia isn't as a European company caught between superpowers, but as an illustration of what happens when you simultaneously lack gravitational mass and remain locked in another's orbit. You're not even valuable enough to be fought for. You're simply collateral damage. Your interests end up beneath consideration in contests that consume you. The irony is that Europe should excel at multipolarity. Its geographic position is nearly ideal, connected to both Asia and America, sitting at the crossroads of multiple gravitational fields. It should normally benefit from all poles, on top of being one itself. Yet far from exploiting this position, Europe is systematically severing itself from all gravitational fields except one, turning the continent into an isolated peninsula at Eurasia's edge, disconnected from its natural hinterland, dependent on a distant predatory power, and increasingly irrelevant to the great games being played across the landmass it borders. This is all the more ironic given Europe's own intellectual traditions, balance of power diplomacy, the Congress system, the intricate statecraft that once defined European politics, all born from the understanding that in a world of multiple poles, you maintain relationships with everyone and get captured by no one. But that wisdom has atrophied, replaced by the world of Care Bears logic that mistakes moral posturing for strategic thinking. Europe clings to ideology, while Asia practices the pragmatism and wisdom it once mastered.
It's almost absurd. Europe, sitting at the perfect crossroads of multiple gravitational fields, finds itself paralyzed by the very multipolarity for which it had invented the tools to navigate. Europe should perhaps consider rereading its own medieval Jesuit missionaries. They understood geopolitical gravity far better than those currently sitting in Brussels.
All right, so here now with me to break down that article is Arnaud Bertrand, the author himself. Thank you so much for joining me today, Arnaud.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Now, right out of the gate, I think we've got some quick housekeeping to handle. There's been a major update on the Nexperia debacle, with the Dutch essentially capitulating and reversing their seizure decision, which obviously happened after you wrote this article. Now, normally Europe seems all too eager to sacrifice its own interests just to toe the US line. But walk us through what you think went down here. Does this signal a real shift in European thinking, or was it simply too much, even for them, to stomach the fallout? Break down what happened, why you think it played out the way it did, and whether it was inevitable, and how it ties into your geopolitical gravity thesis, of course.
Yeah, so what happened with Nexperia, as a reminder, it all started because the US introduced this so-called BIS 50% rule, which considerably expanded their sanctions against Chinese companies. Basically, that rule was saying any company that we sanction today, any of their subsidiaries, so the companies that those companies own, are also sanctioned. And so as a result, that was going to expand the number of Chinese companies or companies owned by Chinese companies under American sanctions from 1,300 to 20,000. So almost a 20x expansion of US sanctions on China. And that's when China introduced their rare earth export controls. If you remember, in the beginning of October, I think that was, which made the US completely freak out. I remember Secretary of Treasury Besant even said that was like a China attack on the world and so on, like really, really freak out language. And the end result is that in the deal that Trump and Xi made in Busan, in South Korea, they both agreed, both sides, so the US and China, agreed to basically retreat. So the US canceled or suspended rather their BIS 50% rule. So all those companies are not sanctioned in the end. And China agreed to suspend its rare earth export controls. And the reason why that's very relevant for Nexperia is because that was the origin of the Nexperia story. The origin was that Nexperia, being a company owned by a Chinese company, was going to be sanctioned by the US. That's why the Dutch wanted to confiscate it effectively from China. But because that was withdrawn by the US, then the Dutch were kind of left holding the bag, right? Because they were like, we sanctioned, we seized Nexperia to comply with your rules, but now you've withdrawn the rules without telling us, by the way. You made your own deal with China. China is sanctioning us as a result, and we're kind of in the middle, and we have nothing to show for it. We have no rationale for it anymore. And that's why they ended the seizure, basically. It's not, unfortunately, signaling a shift in European thinking. They're again effectively following the US once more, because the US withdrew this BIS 50% rules. The answer to your question is no, unfortunately, Europe is still not independent.
Now, if we take a moment to back up, though, I want to dive into this Western dominance and the big shift that's underway. In your article, you highlight how applying organized violence was a key tool in building that dominance. But soft power has also been a huge area of spending for the US. So what I want to know is, how important was that soft power in reality? And can China compete in that space? Or is it even necessary to compete in that space anymore at all?
So that's a question I've often asked myself, and I know you have too. I've long wondered why China was so bad at PR, because that's a common misconception. People think that China is very good at propaganda, but the truth is that they really suck at it. Then I realized that they go at it a completely different way. So in Chinese culture, talk is cheap. It's vulgar even. This really surprised me at the beginning with my wife, who I met more than 20 years ago. She was really uncomfortable, even borderline annoyed, when I was telling her that I loved her, because, that's the thing you do, right? In our mind, you just don't say those things. Rather, you should act to demonstrate them. And this is the case in most Chinese families. It's rare to say, I love you, but in exchange, the devotion and dedication that Chinese parents and grandparents demonstrate to their kids or grandkids is really unparalleled. In Chinese culture, it's very much about proving your love, proving rather than speaking. And speaking is borderline insulting, or at least seen in a somewhat manipulative light, as if you need to convince someone of something that should be obvious from your behavior. And for the government too, this has very deep philosophical roots. For instance, there is this 4th century BC Chinese political philosopher called Shen Buhai, who had this famous saying that the sage ruler depends upon methods, not on his sagacity. So not on what he's saying. He should employ technique, not theory. Sage rulers should focus on producing results rather than, saying stuff. That's very much the Chinese thinking. Reality comes first, not the world. This has plenty of concrete consequences, and it's probably in no small way why, Marx's framework, historical materialism, was so powerful in China, that the Chinese like it so much. It's because the idea that it's material conditions and economic relations that form the base that determine the ideological superstructure. So it's reality comes first, not what you say. In effect, this is, geopolitical gravity. So it's China betting on reality, not on words. And at some point, reality, catches up. It can't be denied anymore. And the narrative change as a result. Whereas the West almost, took a completely different approach, where it's the narrative comes first, the world comes first, and hopefully reality will follow. But the fact is, that's what the upcoming re-importance of geopolitical gravity shows, is that that didn't work. So the bet that reality will come first won. So this is really China's approach to soft power. It's reality-based, example-based, where they walk the talk, and that has much more staying power than the West approach, which is, to change the narrative in an attempt to change reality. yeah, that's might work in the short term, but in the long term, reality asserts itself.
So now it seems as though in the beginning, when America spoke a lot, and their actions didn't necessarily match their words, they didn't necessarily live by the rules that they wanted to apply to the entire world, they were really good at telling those stories in their attempt to push this soft power. And it's not that China was not necessarily, they weren't trying to avoid doing that. They were just really bad at it. But the gestation period of actually leading by actions and it catching up with people realizing, oh, the reality is that we can work with China. And I think it's probably more obvious in the global south than it is in the West. Inadvertently, maybe sounds like the importance of soft power in the sense of lip service has kind of substantially been reduced, because all of that lip service that was coming from the West, all of those narratives that was coming from the West turned out to be false, or they don't live by these own rules, like I said. And now China's actions on the global stage has kind of caught up with itself, where people realize, oh, no, it's actually safe to deal with China. We're not going to have our governments overthrown. We're not going to have our leaders assassinated. They're not going to foment riots in our country. So maybe inadvertently, the answer is that soft power lip service is less important now than it was before, because people are just seeing with their own eyes concrete examples of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will go even further. And that's the point I make in the article. I think it was a major strategic mistake for the West, and for three reasons. The first one is because when you don't base your actions on truth, which is exactly what that was, right? It's basically painting China or other countries. It was not limited to China. Yeah. Russia was very much part of that mix, or the whole Muslim world, and so on and so forth. When you don't base your action on truth, that always ends up producing a disaster.
It will eventually catch up with us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we've seen that with China in a lot of ways. And just even this year, when what Trump was trying to do with his tariffs is basically he had this understanding of China, which is completely wrong, as depending on exports to the US, where if China can't export to the US, then their economy is gone. In fact, he even said something to that effect a couple of times. But that's not the truth. The truth is actually China depends very little on exports to the US. I think something to the order of 2% of their GDP. And so when he went out with his tariffs, China was like, okay, like we match you. We have no issue with that. And in the end, that was a fail for the US, and they backed down and so on. And we've seen time and time again this sort of thing. So that's the first reason. If you're not based on truth, then your actions don't work. As simple as that. Then, just like you said, the thing with lies is that people eventually find out that they were lies, and therefore you undermine trust, which is what has happened what eventually happens for all the lies that the US says. Eventually people discover the truth, and trust in the US, or even within the US, trust for the government, institutions, and so on, are at an all-time low, which is pretty bad, because trust is really the basis of a state. If you don't have trust, you don't have much left. And then the last reason is, as per my Care Bears point in the article, you promote complacency, where you base your strategy on moral posturing, on saying those guys are bad, we're good. That's not a strategy. Moral posturing is not a strategy. A strategy is always based on actions. China was very much acting, creating the mass, if we keep the gravity analogy, creating its own mass, and what the West was doing was just speaking, basically. That's obviously bad for them. That's the irony. In many ways, the anti-China propaganda has actually helped China and was a big strategic mistake for the West.
Right.
Yeah. One last point. I don't think that, a deeper point is that even if people did believe the propaganda, that doesn't even matter much. That's the Argentina example in my article, where you have Milei in Argentina, who obviously believes all the propaganda. He drinks it by the by the fire hose, basically, listen to what he says about communism, about Israel, and so on and so forth. But still, he creates those links with China. He does business with them because material conditions trump just words, propaganda, and ideas. Yeah.
Now, continuing on that theme of behavior and going back to your article, you touch on how behavior can impact countries' willingness to deal with China, but the main focus of your article is on the practical and economic upsides. Now, I've always suspected, though, that even if the global South leaders knew it made more sense to partner with China on those fronts, economic and things like that, their populations have often been swayed by Western propaganda, or that soft power we were talking about earlier, to view China as some sort of an evil empire. But when the U.S. is spouting that vitriol while backing what's happening in Gaza, for example, and many other things, they're hardly in a moral position to lecture anyone. Even if we look at the worst case scenario, like you were saying, even if people still buy into the anti-China narrative, from their perspective, it might not matter anymore. Both superpowers come off as just as evil, so why not go with the one that's offering bigger economic benefits? So my question is, has this mask-off moment, so to speak, for the U.S. been a game changer, making it easier for global South countries to pursue ties with China now that their populations aren't necessarily so keen on just sticking with America predominantly?
I think it does to some extent, but because then it's probably mostly at the election moment, because of public opinions, then they're less likely to vote for someone who is very pro-US or anti-China. But I wouldn't overstate the importance of that, because again, the structural reality, I think, matters much more, as we're seeing with Milei. Again, like, population voted for him, a man who is staunchly anti-communist. In the end, because of the structural reality, he has no other choice than to deal with China. And I think that there were a couple of studies on this, actually, studying the correlation between public opinion on what governments actually do. Most studies that I've seen on this actually show that, strangely, even in so-called democratic countries, liberal democracies, the correlation is basically null. So there is very little correlation. That's not what leaders and governments are thinking about when they enact policies. They simply look normally at the structural reality that's in place and decide based on that. So you will have much more influence on the government's behavior if you change the structural reality in which they make decisions, rather than make them think that your cause is just or your adversaries' causes are unjust. In a way, that's a bit the plight of the Palestinians. I think most people can agree around the world that their cause is very just, but they have no power. That's the issue, right? And so they have no power to affect the structural reality, and therefore many countries end up siding with Israel. So yeah, I think that's more like it. It helps to some extent at the moment of elections, but I wouldn't overstate the importance of it.
That's a really good example. I mean, the Palestine example is a really good example of Kamala Harris even shooting herself in the foot, going against what her own voters wanted. So it seems like that would potentially play a role at getting people to the door, but a very, very minimal role. That makes sense, definitely. Now, on China's gravitational centrality that you talk about, drawing from Zhao Long's human body metaphor, you suggest that China's approach is systemic and integrative rather than zero-sum territorial dominance like the Monroe Doctrine. Do you believe that this model is very uniquely Chinese and rooted in history like the tributary system, or could it be adopted by other powers in a multipolar world? And taking it a step further, will it even become a necessary model to adopt in order to compete for a global power in this new environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Zhao Long's human body metaphor reflects deep Chinese philosophy, basically the understanding that everything is systemic, that we live in a systemic world rather than a world sum of parts. So where everything is not a sum of parts, everything is holistic, interconnected. It's also the TCM understanding of the world. Traditional Chinese medicine, views things this way, that the body is a whole where everything is interconnected. Like you can't isolate, one part without considering the role it plays in the entire system. So it's more than a model or an approach. It's a fundamental understanding of the world based on, very deep-rooted Chinese philosophy. And of course, the West, as per our own philosophy, we view things quite differently. To us, there is good and evil. Like that's very deep in our culture. If you read the Bible, it's all about that. There is good and evil, and the good must prevail, and evil be defeated. Whereas China, interestingly, it's almost the complete opposite, because a key philosophical concept in China is Yin-Yang, where yin will be the good and yang will be the bad, the evil. But if you try to optimize or magnify the good and destroy the bad, then you at the same time destroy the good. That's what yin yang is all about. So the good only exists because the bad exists. So if you try to destroy the bad, then the good ceases to exist as well. So what you're seeking for is balance, is harmony. So it's a fundamentally different understanding of the world than we do. So I think at heart, it's actually a question of who is more right philosophically. Is the world more intrinsically systemic or zero-sum? And I suspect that whoever adapts himself more to the deeper truth of the world will have an advantage. In other words, if the underlying reality is more systemic and you act based on that, it gives you an advantage, because over the long term, reality always wins, and you can only be in contradiction with reality for so long. So I personally think that the world is systemic, and if you look at it in that way and adapt yourself to a world that is systemic, then you're more adapted to reality, and therefore your model makes more sense than if you look at the world in a zero-sum way, because the world is not zero-sum. And so if your model is predicated on the fact that the world is zero-sum, then you have a disadvantage. That's the way
Right.
I think China looks at it. And yeah, I think they're right in that respect.
I'm wondering about specific examples of China understanding that good exists with bad, specific examples. I wonder if this is a good fit, or if you can think of a better example to illustrate that. But a lot of people who support China are disappointed that they still trade with Israel, and that they understand that China could put a lot of pressure on Israel to potentially sway them or stop them from doing what they're doing. But China has already decided that they don't interfere in the politics of foreign countries. They don't want to be the US again. They will use sanctions if they are being attacked in response to something, but they can't go out and try to stop some sort of a conflict that has nothing to do with them. Would that be a good example of yin and yang existing together, saying that there is a good outcome when you say that you're not going to interfere in the affairs of others? Kind of like, if you're a Star Trek fan, the prime directive of sorts. Sometimes that's going to create an uncomfortable situation where you could potentially do something to help these people, but you've already said this is our philosophy in this department. Would you say that that's a good example of this yin and yang, or could you come up with something different, for example?
Yeah, I think it's not a bad one. I think basically China's thinking around that particular question is that would be like acting like the US for the opposing camp, right? Where you're basically becoming missionary, trying to maximize the good from what your own standpoint is of good. So on the side of Palestine rather than Israel. But in doing so, you adopt the mental framework, right, of maximizing the good, trying to diminish the bad, and so on and so forth. And so as such, you become like them, which delegitimizes you as an alternative, because you're just like them, but for the other camp. I think that would be the way they look at it. You even had this Deng Xiaoping speech at the UN one day where he said that if China were ever to act in an imperialistic way, so like the US, the peoples of the world should unite and bring it down. Yeah, that's very key. That's very key to them. Yeah, that's not
Right.
a bad example. Yeah.
Okay. Moving back to a topic we were discussing a little bit earlier with Europe, but looking to the future, let's get into some advice for navigating multipolarity. So if you were advising European leaders today, what concrete steps would you recommend to generate their own gravitational pull, especially in light of updates with Nexperia and the resolution? How can they escape the trap that they're in and start prioritizing what's best for themselves?
The first thing I will tell Europe is fix Europe politically, because right now there is no one that really speaks for Europe, that defines the strategy. That's probably the key problem in Europe right now. There is no strong political entity called Europe. After his trip in China, you had Macron speak on behalf of Europe to say that he threatened China and said that we will put tariffs on China. But then immediately you had other European leaders like the Germans saying, you're not the leader of Europe. You can't speak for Europe. Von der Leyen, she often speaks for Europe, but she actually doesn't have the power to do so either. And many states are opposed to what she says, and she doesn't have much power to constrain them. Kaja Kallas, everyone in Europe is basically holding their face when she speaks. There is no, it's the famous Kissinger saying, Europe, who do I call? There is no one, there is no strong political entity. So I often say that there is either too much Europe or not enough Europe, but the amount of Europe right now is not is not right. Either you create some sort of federal Europe, like a country, China or the US, a massive country with nations becoming provinces or states, or you go back to giving nations their sovereignty and you effectively dissolve the European project or keep it at a much smaller sort of cooperation scale. That would be the first thing. I think the right decision would be the federal one for plenty of reasons. Maybe it goes beyond the scope of this discussion. Then the second thing would be to get rid of this moral posturing, this value discourse, rather seek influence by the power of your example, by what you're doing, rather than hypocritical lectures. Build successes at home and let those successes speak for themselves rather than just speak. The third thing, in order to create your own gravity, is focus on the material conditions. Make sure that you have your own army for a start, because you can never be powerful if you depend on someone 8,000 miles away to defend you. Create your own independence when it comes to tech. Basically, create a European model for everything. Make European sovereignty matter in all the respects in order to become protected in that respect and defend your own interests and have a unique voice based on that, based on your own interests.
That's interesting that it does seem like they're stuck in between a middle ground. You either are independent sovereign countries or you are an entity that really works together. And they've managed to find themselves stuck in a middle ground that's, worse than both of those possible options on either side. It looks like they need, obviously,
Exactly.
other than the moral posturing and stopping the lip service, it sounds like they need massive structural changes to really be able to tackle this problem. Now, finally, I want to end on this because the U.S. just dropped a new national security strategy. I know you've been writing about it already, and we've been talking about it. And it basically revives the Monroe Doctrine. Again, we've talked about this offline, but can you break down its implications for China's gravitational pull? And might it even create opposing magnetic fields from America that ends up pushing some of these impacted countries in their hemisphere even closer to China?
Yeah, exactly. So I think when you read the national security strategy, it pretty much validates the return of geopolitical gravity, because it's quite incredible to see that they specifically call hegemony like US hegemony, fundamentally impossible. And their national security strategy is basically them reprioritizing their own hemisphere with exactly that, the Monroe Doctrine. So they're basically saying we cannot defy structural forces indefinitely through like will, rhetoric, or ideology. We need to focus back on ourselves, on where our gravity is strongest, which is where we are. They implicitly admit that gravitational pull only works where you have proximity and concentrated mass. That's what it is. And on your opposing magnetic field point, Chas Freeman, who I guess just to introduce him, is, in my mind, the wisest diplomat that the US ever produced. So he's the former assistant secretary. He was Nixon's interpreter during the famous 1972 trip. He's been ambassador multiple times for the US and so on. Now he's become a very strong critic of foreign policy and US strategy, and he understands China extremely well. And his take on the current situation on the national security strategy was that the US is ceding the future to China. So it's exactly what you're saying, that they're basically retrenching on their own hemisphere. He calls it self-containment, which is quite strong. And what that does, nature hates vacuum. So obviously, the countries the US lives where it doesn't exert gravity anymore will be naturally more attracted to China's gravitational pull. So I think the exact quote from Freeman is that America is creating a world divided between the US and a few vassal states and a global coalition animated by aversion to our selfishness and bullying behavior and alignment against us with China. So that's the future as he sees it, basically.
Right. So as they withdraw from these countries that are not in their hemisphere, it creates room for China's gravity to pull them in, obviously, especially if it makes sense economically. But what I was also wondering, though, was in the countries affected by the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, if they start to exert more pressure there, I'm wondering if it could potentially create that opposite effect also, though, where it's going to actively alert these countries that they better start building other alliances while this pressure is coming down on them. Or do you think that what the U.S. is doing in terms of, recapturing them into their gravity will actually work?
Well, there are several dimensions. So I think that for those countries, China is a much bigger partner, economically speaking, just because, China is simply so much bigger in that respect than the US. I was just looking at some, not for Latin American country, but for Russia. But I think this is quite a good illustration. At the peak of relations with Russia in like 2010, 2011, US-Russia relations, when they were at their best, the trading volume between Russia and the US was $40 billion a year. That's the most the US could offer Russia. Right now, with China, it's 300 billion. That matters a lot, right, for countries. And that's why the whole narrative on the US putting a reverse Kissinger on Russia makes absolutely no sense. You're not going to give up a $300 billion relation in favor of a $40 billion one. So if those countries are given a choice from their own basic interests, they will favor China because simply China is much larger economically for them. The US at this stage can offer less economically. But you could have some sort of situation, basically like the Soviet Union did during the Cold War, with some sort of Iron Curtain, where they forced those countries to, militarily speaking, to only trade with them. And so that will not be in the material interest of those countries. Many people in those countries will despise the US for that, and it's not sustainable, and so on and so forth. They could do that, and I don't think that China would militarily act there because that's simply not what they do.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a much more difficult task. I remember even John Perkins, the guy who wrote the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, who's fairly anti-China, so to speak. Even he said he has many friends in government in Latin America, and they said that, according to him, they said that we know that China's after our minerals and our products also, but the thing that China won't do that the U.S. does is overthrow our governments, assassinate our leaders, foment riots, and so it's a safer option. So they're going to have a lot more difficult of a task in order to bring them back into their gravity, but I'm sure they're going to try really hard. Thank you so much for joining me, Arnaud. And for everybody else, if you want to see more of these, we do have a few of these planned, so definitely hit the subscribe button and also check out Arnaud's Substack, because there are many other articles on geopolitics available there. Very insightful. I highly recommend it. I will put the link in the description. Once again, Arnaud, thank you. And until next time, take care.
Thank you, Daniel.